know. I grew up reading the tabloids, I think, from a different perspective. You know, they were taking pictures of our family and we were in them. So it was different than kids who just...
How do you grow up when your father is one of the most famous rock stars on the planet? For Sophie Simmons, there was no escaping it. While the world knew Gene Simmons as the fire-breathing, blood-spitting face of Kiss, she knew the man behind the makeup. Now, Sophie is revealing what life was really like behind the fame, and her story paints a very different picture from the one most people imagined. So what was it really like growing up as Gene Simmons' daughter? And what has Sophie finally revealed about the reality behind the rock and roll legend? Join us as we uncover the story behind Sophie Simmons' extraordinary childhood. The job nobody's father had. Most children grow up able to describe what their parents do for a living in a single sentence. For Sophie Simmons, that simple childhood exercise turned into something considerably more complicated, because there was no easy sentence that captured what Gene Simmons actually did. Her father breathed fire on stage. He spit blood as part of his performance. He wore elaborate theatrical makeup that transformed his face into the character known as the Demon. He performed in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans as part of one of the most successful rock bands in history. Try explaining that to a classroom of 9-year-olds during show and tell. Sophie admitted that her own feelings about this reality evolved considerably over the years. As a young child, the stage character could feel genuinely intimidating, even frightening, despite knowing it was her own father underneath the makeup. Later, as she got older and more self-conscious, that same larger-than-life persona became a source of embarrassment. The kind of thing a teenager desperately wishes was not attached to their family name. Eventually, somewhere along the way, she arrived at a distinction that became one of the most important lessons of her entire childhood. The Demon was a character. Dad was someone else entirely. That separation, learning to hold two completely different versions of the same person in her mind without confusing them, sounds simple when stated out loud. In practice, it required Sophie to develop an entire internal framework that most children never have to build. She had to learn, at an age when most kids are just figuring out how the world works at all, that the person breathing fire under blinding stage lights and the person who tucked her in at night were simply two different jobs the same man happened to hold. This was the foundation everything else in her childhood was built on top of, and it gave her a perspective that very few people on the planet have ever actually had to develop. But the fire-breathing persona was only the most visible part of what made her childhood unusual. Underneath the theatrics was a much more rigid and demanding set of expectations that her father quietly insisted on every single day. So what exactly did Gene Simmons actually prioritize once the stage makeup came off? The businessman behind the Demon.
Kids feeling what I felt, the world ended. I felt like, I felt guilty. What did I do wrong that made my father get up and leave without explaining anything?
Gene Simmons has publicly stated for decades that he avoided drugs and alcohol throughout his life, a choice that stood in sharp contrast to much of the rock and roll culture surrounding him. Those choices directly shaped how he raised his children. Rather than glamorizing risky behavior in the way that so much of the rock world around him did, Gene consistently emphasized self-control and personal responsibility. This was not a household built around chaos, despite the public image that the band's stage shows and reputation might suggest. According to Sophie's own account, education and financial literacy were treated as serious, non-negotiable priorities in the Simmons household. She grew up watching her father approach his entire life, not just as an entertainer, but equally as a businessman. While fans around the world were experiencing concerts, album releases, and the spectacle of Kiss as pure entertainment, Sophie was seeing something entirely different from the inside. She saw contracts being negotiated and also saw planning that extended years into the future, treating the band's image and brand with the same seriousness most people reserve for running a Fortune 500 company. The lessons Sophie absorbed during these years were not really about music at all, even though she would eventually pursue a music career of her own. They were about life, about how to think strategically, about how to build something that lasts rather than chasing something flashy and temporary. Her father, despite all the fire and the platform boots and the larger-than-life persona, was teaching her the unglamorous fundamentals of business discipline practically every single day, whether she fully realized it at the time or not. That foundation of structure and discipline would matter enormously once Sophie's own life took an unexpected and very public turn, one that placed cameras inside her actual home rather than just at her father's concerts. So, what happened when the entire world suddenly got an unfiltered look inside the Simmons household? And how did that change everything for a teenage girl who had already spent her whole life trying to separate the performer from the person? When the cameras came home.
We're talking about, what happens with when foster kids.
Perhaps the most unusual chapter of Sophie's entire childhood did not happen on a concert stage at all. It happened inside her own living room, broadcast to audiences around the world. When the reality series Gene Simmons' Family Jewels premiered in 2006, audiences gained an unprecedented level of access into the Simmons household. For 6 full seasons, cameras followed Gene, his longtime partner Shannon Tweed, Sophie, and her brother Nick through the genuine, unscripted texture of everyday family life. Think about what that actually meant for a teenage girl. Most adolescents struggle enough with the ordinary embarrassments of having parents at all. The awkward conversations, the rules that feel unfair, the simple mortification of being seen by a crush while your dad is doing something cringeworthy in the driveway. Sophie experienced every single one of those completely universal teenage moments, except hers were captured on camera and broadcast to millions of viewers across the world. Sophie Simmons began her acting career starring in this exact reality series, which gave the public its first real look at the family life behind one of rock's most legendary frontmen. The show was not simply a vanity project documenting a rock star's mansion. It became, over its 6-season run, a genuine window into how a family built around a globally famous performer actually functioned day to day, complete with the arguments, the embarrassments, and the surprisingly normal domestic routines that existed underneath the fame. What makes this part of Sophie's story so interesting is the contrast it created. She had spent her early childhood learning to separate the public demon character from her private father. Now, suddenly, there was no real separation left to maintain. Her actual private life, the unguarded version of her family that she had spent years carefully distinguishing from the stage persona, was now itself becoming public content for the entire world to watch and judge. That kind of exposure inevitably invites scrutiny, and for a young woman who did not look like the typical celebrity offspring the tabloids were used to covering, that scrutiny arrived faster and harder than anyone in her family fully anticipated. What happened when the cameras and the headlines started focusing specifically on Sophie's body, rather than her father's music? The headline that followed her around the world. There is a moment in Sophie Simmons' life that she has described as a genuine turning point, one that crystallized everything difficult about growing up with a famous last name in the worst possible way. Growing up, Sophie was the same size as her mother, Shannon Tweed, and the two of them used to share clothes. But living in the public eye meant enduring comments about her figure that most teenagers never have to face, let alone on the cover of international tabloids. The moment that stands out most happened during a family vacation. Sophie was wearing a thong bikini, modeling herself after her favorite celebrity at the time, Sofia Vergara. Someone photographed her without her knowledge. As a 17-year-old girl, she opened a newspaper one day and saw her own body, specifically her backside, on the cover of the Daily Mail, accompanied by the headline, "Gene Simmons, plus-size daughter." The story did not stay contained to one newspaper. It made what she has described as the global news circuit, spreading across outlets and countries, attaching a label to her body that she had never asked for and certainly never consented to having broadcast to the entire planet. Sophie has spoken openly about what that period actually did to her sense of self. She described growing up a chubby kid who became a curvy young woman, and said that she herself was largely okay with that reality. The world, however, clearly was not. At 17 years old, an age when most teenagers are already navigating enough insecurity about their changing bodies without any outside interference at all, Sophie had to process that experience while the entire world was simultaneously weighing in on it through headlines, comment sections, and tabloid covers. She has talked about this period years later in interviews, acknowledging that even after the body positivity movement eventually became more mainstream, the criticism she received never fully disappeared. It simply became mixed. Some people now told her she was too big to be a model, the exact same kind of comment she had grown up hearing her entire life, even as other voices began pushing back in her defense. What Sophie eventually did with this painful chapter of her life is part of what makes her story genuinely remarkable, rather than simply sad. Instead of disappearing from public view or trying to reshape herself into something more conventionally palatable to tabloid standards, she made a deliberate choice that very few people in her position would have had the courage to make. What exactly did Sophie decide to do once she had the platform and the opportunity to respond to everything she had endured? Turning the pain into a purpose. Rather than retreating from the public eye after years of body-based criticism, Sophie Simmons eventually made the deliberate choice to step directly into an industry built almost entirely around physical image, and to do it entirely on her own terms. When the lingerie company Adore Me approached her about becoming one of the faces of their modeling campaign, Sophie has said it was not something she had ever aspired to as a young girl. She did not grow up imagining herself as a lingerie or swimsuit model because she genuinely did not believe she had the right body type for that kind of work. But she later recognized that belief as a misconception rooted entirely in what she had been shown growing up. The supermodels she saw as a child were uniformly thin, the kind of body type that gave young girls like her no real frame of reference for what beauty could actually look like beyond one narrow standard. When Adore Me offered her the opportunity, Sophie recognized it as the perfect chance to push herself outside her own comfort zone, while simultaneously giving other young women the chance to see a body type genuinely represented in fashion campaigns, the exact representation she had never had access to herself growing up. That decision required a kind of bravery that goes beyond simply agreeing to model. Sophie has been remarkably outspoken about her insistence on authenticity in how her body is actually presented to the public. She refused to allow photographs of her body to be digitally manipulated or retouched. When the first photos came back from a shoot for her own clothing line, Sophie X The Style Club, she looked at the images and immediately thought her legs looked too good to be real. She asked whether the photos had been altered using Photoshop, and when she learned that they had, she said something almost nobody in her position typically says out loud: "Can you change them back?" She has said directly that a size 8 is her own personal happy place, and that she genuinely enjoys eating, refusing to apologize for either fact. This was not performative body positivity recited for an interview. It was a consistent, lived philosophy that showed up in how she ran her business, how she approached her own modeling career, and how she chose to respond to the very criticism that had once put her on the cover of a tabloid as a teenager. Sophie has also said that she receives messages directly from young girls reaching out to her on social media, sharing struggles that are, in her own words, no different from what she went through during her own adolescence. She has noted that all young women tend to face remarkably similar struggles around body image and self-acceptance, but that, for whatever reason, they so rarely talk openly with each other about it. She has consistently encouraged her followers to reach out to her directly if they are struggling, positioning herself as someone available to listen and offer advice. She has also been explicit about crediting her own ability to remain confident in her body, to having a genuinely supportive family and friend group surrounding her. The exact kind of support system she now actively tries to extend to strangers who reach out to her online. This transformation, from a 17-year-old blindsided by a cruel tabloid headline into a grown woman actively building a platform around body acceptance, did not happen in isolation. It happened alongside an evolving relationship with the father, whose own larger-than-life persona had shaped her entire understanding of fame in the first place. So how exactly did Sophie's relationship with Gene Simmons change as she grew older? And what specific role did he actually play once she started dating and building her own independent identity? The protective father behind the demon mask. Every parent eventually faces the moment their child starts dating, and most fathers, regardless of profession, find themselves becoming a little more protective during this particular chapter of parenthood. Gene Simmons was no exception to this universal pattern. The difference, of course, was that Gene Simmons happened to be one of the most recognizable men in the entire history of rock music, which meant his protectiveness toward Sophie carried a different kind of weight and visibility than it would have for an ordinary father. It is one thing to bring a date home to meet your dad. It is an entirely different experience to bring a date home to meet a global rock icon, known for spitting blood on stage in front of stadiums full of people. At the same time, Sophie has spoken about a genuine desire for independence that mirrors many of the core lessons Gene worked to instill in her throughout her entire childhood. The recurring message was always the same: earn your own success. Build something genuinely yours, rather than relying on the family name to do the work for you. That value, the insistence on earning things independently rather than coasting on inherited fame, shaped one of the more interesting and lesser-known chapters of Sophie's young adulthood. During her late teens and early 20s, she deliberately stepped back from Hollywood and the entertainment industry entirely. Instead, she played volleyball and majored in religious studies at Pitzer-Pomona College in Claremont, California. During this same period, she also founded a charity for abused children in Vancouver, Canada, called Sophie's Place, a meaningful nod to her mother's Canadian roots. Sophie has explained directly why she chose to step away from the industry during these formative years. I had avoided being part of the industry for so long. I'd say I'm a singer and people would be like, "Do you sing rock?" I hated being compared to my family. That single comment captures something genuinely difficult about being the child of an enormously famous parent. Even when Sophie tried to pursue something entirely her own, music, the immediate public assumption automatically routed her back through her father's identity, as though her own creative voice could only ever be understood in relation to his. She has acknowledged learning this kind of unflinching directness from her father himself, describing him as someone who has always been extremely direct and straightforward in how he communicates, famously so. Whatever frustration she felt at constantly being compared to her family, she expressed that frustration with the same blunt honesty her father has built an entire public persona around, a trait she clearly inherited even while trying to forge a separate identity from him. As Sophie eventually grew older, her relationship with Gene continued evolving in the way that most parent-child dynamics naturally do over time. Today, Sophie speaks about her father with a mixture of admiration, humor, and genuine appreciation. She respects what he has accomplished across his career. She values the lessons he worked to teach her growing up. At the same time, she has worked hard and deliberately to establish an identity entirely her own, separate from his shadow. Gene's continued support for Sophie's independent ambitions suggests that the values he emphasized so consistently throughout her childhood were never really about exercising control over her choices. They were about preparation, about equipping her to succeed entirely on her own, without needing to lean on him. By most accounts available, including her own description of her career trajectory across music, fashion, modeling, and philanthropy, Sophie has done exactly that. What emerges from all of this, when you step back and look at the entire arc of Sophie Simmons' life, is a story that runs almost completely counter to what most people would assume about growing up as the child of one of rock's most theatrical and outrageous frontmen. What does the full picture actually reveal about who Gene Simmons was as a father, once you strip away the fire, the blood, and the platform boots? The most unexpected Gene Simmons story of all. If you only knew Gene Simmons from his stage persona, the studded codpieces, the platform boots, the tongue, the blood, the fire, you would reasonably expect his children to have grown up in an environment of pure chaos and excess, the kind of rock and roll lifestyle that the band's reputation has been built on for decades. The actual story, according to his own daughter's account, is almost the complete opposite of that assumption. Sophie Simmons grew up in a household defined by discipline. Her father chose to model self-control and personal responsibility for his children at every turn. Education and financial literacy were treated with genuine seriousness, not as afterthoughts squeezed in between tour dates. She watched her father operate as a calculated, strategic businessman behind the curtain of his outrageous public persona, absorbing lessons about negotiation, planning, and long-term thinking that had nothing to do with music itself. Instead, it was a childhood shaped by structure, expectations, and life lessons from a father determined to make absolutely sure his children earned their own place in the world. And in the end, that may genuinely be the most unexpected Gene Simmons story of all. That does not mean Sophie's childhood was without genuine difficulty. The painful tabloid headline at 17 years old was real, and the wound it left took years to fully process. The years of comparison to her famous family, the years of having her own creative voice automatically filtered through her father's identity, were real struggles that she has openly acknowledged. The strange experience of living a private family life that was simultaneously broadcast to the entire world through reality television was a genuinely unusual burden for any teenager to carry. But running underneath all of that difficulty was something far more stable and far less expected than anyone outside the family circle would have guessed. A father who, despite his blood-spitting, fire-breathing public image, was quietly building something deliberate and lasting at home, teaching his daughter that her worth would never be measured by her body type, her last name, or the headlines written about her, but by what she actually chose to build with the foundation he had given her. Sophie Simmons took that foundation and built a music career, a clothing line, a modeling presence rooted in authenticity rather than retouched perfection, and a charity dedicated to protecting abused children. She did it while consistently separating herself from her father's shadow, even as she continued to credit him with genuine warmth for many of the values that made all of it possible in the first place. What part of Sophie's story surprised you the most? The discipline behind the chaos, or the courage it took to turn her pain into purpose? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.